On behalf of the Accelerate Cures and Treatments for All Dementias Coalition, I would like to welcome you all to the webinar, Financing the Cure, the Ecosystem of Alzheimer's Disease Research Funding. My name is Ryan Carney, and I serve as the Manager of Public Policy at the Alliance for Aging Research, the convening organization of the ACT-AD Coalition. As a quick background for those unfamiliar with ACT-AD, we are a coalition formed in 2005, comprising of over 50 national nonprofit organizations representing researchers, clinicians, patient, and family caregiver groups. The coalition was formed to serve as a single point of advocacy for organizations wanting to collaborate with the FDA on key issues impacting the development of therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. If your organization is not currently a member of ACT-AD and are interested in learning more about us, please visit www.act-ad.org or send me an email after the webinar. My contact information will be shared at the end of today's presentations. The ACT-AD team is very excited to have Dr. Jeffrey Cummings and Dwayne Schultheis join us today to help us better understand the complex financing system funding our search for effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Today, we will have presentations on how innovation within Alzheimer's disease treatment pipeline is funded, the unique roles of government and private stakeholders, and potential policy threats to the future of research funding. Before we dive into today's presentations, a few items need to be addressed up top. First, a big thank you to ACT-AD sponsors. Our patron level sponsors, Avenir, Biogen, Utska, and Janssen. Our supporter level sponsors, Acadia, Eli Lilly, Green Valley, and Merck. And our small business sponsors, Alzheimer's, DreamQuest, and Anavex. We appreciate your partnership with the coalition and recognize we would not exist without your generous support. Next, we will be joined by two friends of the Alliance for Aging Research, Dr. Jeffrey Cummings and Dwayne Schultheis. Dr. Cummings is a research professor in the Department of Brain Health at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Before UNLV, Dr. Cummings served as the founding director of the Cleveland Clinic LaRuvo Center for Brain Health in Las Vegas, as director of the Mary S. Easton Center for Alzheimer's Disease Research and director of the Dean F. Johnson Center for Neurotherapeutics, both at UCLA. As a world-renowned Alzheimer's disease research and clinical trial expert, he has published nearly 800 articles and 44 books devoted to neuroscience, dementia, and clinical trials. Additionally, we are very grateful to have his leadership as a member of the ACT-AD Science Advisory Board. Our second presentation today will be from Dwayne Schultheis. Dwayne is the Managing Director of Vital Transformation, a consultancy focused on quantifying and defining innovation in healthcare. He works regularly with regulators, multinational corporations, governments, and stakeholder groups, clarifying the impact of health policy changes and technological innovation. He has been a speaker at many leading international conferences, including BIO, the European Health Forum, DIA, and the Basel Bicentennial. Mr. Schultheis' 2019 BMJ publication titled "Are CAR-T Therapies Living Up to Their Hype" is considered a groundbreaking analysis in the field of real-world evidence, and has been cited in presentations by the EMA. Additionally, the Alliance has had the pleasure of working with Dwayne on some research he is going to present later today. And next onto the housekeeping items. So we have enabled live transcription for the webinar. You should see this option at the bottom of your screen, and you can click the button to utilize this feature. And we have also left time at the end of today's webinar for a question and answer session. You can utilize the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. Slide. And finally, if you run into any technical issues during the course of today's webinar, you can email Sarah DeGiovane at sdegiovane@agingresearch.com, and we will try to get those resolved as quickly as possible. And lastly, I would like to thank my colleagues, Susan Peshin, Michael Ward, Sarah DeGiovane, and Ashley Leonard for helping organize today's meeting. So if you're ready, Dr. Cummings, we can begin.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'll be talking about financing and funding of Alzheimer's disease drug development. Here are my disclosures. I have consulted for many pharmaceutical companies and biotechnology companies in an effort to help them find the very best treatments for Alzheimer's disease. If we could go back a couple of slides, I think there's a little delay in advancing here. Go back. Go back. You're going forward right now. Back. There we go. Thank you. Could we go back? Could we go back? There we go. If you can stop there. The things that I'll be covering today are cost of Alzheimer's disease drug development, who pays for trials, how does this work into an innovation cycle, and what are some new innovative ways of funding drug development that we're seeing beginning to emerge. I'm sorry. I'm going to give you control of the slides. If you could go back to the first slides, that would be great. Okay, now go ahead one. So we'll start with the cost of Alzheimer's disease drug development. Thank you. Next slide. Here's an analysis from 2014, and this is the most recent Alzheimer's disease specific analysis of the cost of Alzheimer's disease drug development. It's important to know that in 2014, there was very little use of the very costly imaging that we now use in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials, such as amyloid imaging or tau imaging. For example, amyloid imaging, one scan costs around $3,000. So if you have a scan at the beginning and the scan at the end to determine whether the drug is acting on the brain amyloid, that would be $6,000 per participant just for the amyloid imaging. So these estimates are no doubt underestimates, but they are the latest ones that have been generated specifically on Alzheimer's disease. So that you can see that looking at the left-hand second column on the left, the preclinical or non-clinical development, this is in the laboratory, in 2014 cost about $8 million. Phase 1 was about $32 million. Phase 2, $24 million. And phase 3, $67 million for an out-of-pocket cost of $133 million per drug. If we translate that into 2021 dollars, that would be equivalent to $149 million now. However, of course, the cost of the drug development itself is not all of the cost to the company. We have a very high failure rate of Alzheimer's disease drug development. So a successful drug must generate enough income to account for the many unsuccessful drugs. So when the cost of failures and the cost of capital, what else could be done with that money during that period, are taken into account. And in 2014 terms, the cost of a drug development of one agent was $5.693 billion. In 2021 dollars, that would be $6.376 billion. So that you can see that there is enormous cost involved in Alzheimer's disease drug development. Those costs could be brought down if we had fewer failures. And I'll talk about that as we go along. Next slide. Here's an analysis which we have just completed. It is not yet published, but it has been accepted for publication. We looked at the cumulative investment in Alzheimer's disease drug development since 1995. You might know that Tacrin, the very first drug specifically for Alzheimer's disease, was approved in 1993. And donepezil, the most widely used drug for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, was approved in 1996. So this period from 1995 until 2021 captures most of the drug development period, except that very early period of the development of the cholinesterase inhibitors. And what you can see here is the cumulative cost to a total cost of $42.5 billion that have been invested in Alzheimer's disease research clinical trials by industry since 1995. This does not include NIH, philanthropic, or other types of funding. This is only industry funding. This funded 1,097 trials, and remarkably, 183,679 people, participants, participated in those and current trials. So roughly 200,000 people have been involved in those trials. Every one of them had a care partner necessary for the trial, meaning that 400 million individuals have been participating in our clinical trials, a remarkable number. So $42.5 billion have been invested in Alzheimer's disease drug development. Now, those blue symbols at the top symbolizes the actual success of drugs. So you see that there was an approval in 95 and 96. There was an approval in 2000, 2001, and 2003. Then we've gone through this long period of 17 years with no new drug development until the approval, no new drug approval, until the approval of aducanumab 2 weeks ago, 2021. Next slide. So one of the things that we learned in looking at this was the relative cost of investment in the different phases, you know, that a drug goes through phase 1, which is usually normal volunteers, phase 2, which are small trials with the target population of Alzheimer's disease participants, and then the larger preparation for approval of the phase 3 trials. Note that the total investment in phase 1 trials was about $8 billion. In phase 2 trials, it was about $9.6 billion. But in phase 3, it was $24 billion. So again, you can see that one of the ways of bringing down costs is to stop the drug after phase 2 if it truly has no substantive or substantial evidence of likely success. We would save billions of dollars from stopping drug development programs earlier. Next slide. So to summarize this part, the cost of drug development is prohibitively high and the risk of failure is great, 99%. The cost discourages biopharma investment and capital investment. The greatest cost is in phase 3, and stopping drugs sooner would decrease the costs. Some recent estimates of the cost of aducanumab development put it at about $2.5 billion, which was the development program plus the antibody manufacturing facilities. Next slide. The cost of drug development must always be seen in terms of the cost of Alzheimer's disease. So here I'm showing you in the graph above the projected growth of the Alzheimer's disease population in the solid line to around 13.5 million by 2050. If we had a drug that would slow the onset of Alzheimer's disease by 5 years, you can see that we would have only around 7 million people by 2050, a very substantial saving in the number of people involved and the amount of tragedy involved. By 2050, the projected cost of Alzheimer's disease are around $1 trillion. And you can see that if we had a 5-year delay in the onset, we would save more than $350 billion, $350 billion. So almost a third of the projected $1 trillion cost by 2050. Now, aducanumab is not a prevention treatment. It begins after the onset of symptoms. So these calculations do not apply exactly to aducanumab. Nevertheless, the point here is the drug development is costly. The disease is far more costly. Next slide. So who funds Alzheimer's disease drug development? Where does this money come from? Next slide. So before I tell you who funds it, I want to show you exactly what's in the pipeline so that you have a sense of the kind of drugs we're working with. And the main point here is that whether you look at phase 3 or phase 2, the most common type of drug being developed is a disease-modifying agent. So although most of our drugs that are approved now, donepezil, memantine, rivastigmine, galantamine, are all cognitive enhancing drugs, there's very little work in that domain now. And most of the work, as you see, 61% at phase 3, 86% at phase 2, is on disease-modifying agents. So that's where we have to look at the funding. Next slide. So here is a 5-year review of the funding of Alzheimer's disease clinical trials. You see in the orange bar the pharmaceutical support of clinical trials. And what you see there is over the 5-year period, there has either been no increase in individually funded clinical trials by pharma, or even a slight decrease over this 5-year period. However, if you look at the gray bars, you see that there has been a steady increase in public-private partnerships. Now, this is where a pharmaceutical company partners with another organization, usually the NIH, to develop a drug together and to share the cost of that drug development. For example, there is a partnership between ASI and NIH in the current A345 program. So that's an example of the growth of a new type of funding, the public-private partnership during this 5-year period. I also want to call attention to the growth of the NIH funding. Note that during this period, there was nearly a doubling of NIH funding for clinical trials. So that blue bar shows that NIH funding began with funding 27 trials in 2016 and now funds 48 trials in 2020. Next slide. What about disease-modifying therapy sponsors? Now, I've emphasized that these are the major drugs that are in clinical trials now. So if we look at phase 2, you see that the pharmaceutical companies and NIH are funding similar numbers of trials, 19 from pharma and 21 from NIH. There are some public-private partnerships and a few from other entities like the VA. But look at phase 3. All of phase 3 has a pharmaceutical sponsor involved, either as the sole sponsor or as a member of a public-private partnership, and there are no NIH disease-modifying therapies at phase 3. Next slide. If we look at symptomatic therapies, and there's two kinds of symptomatic therapies. There are cognitive enhancing agents, which we have now, and there are drugs that address the neuropsychiatric symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, such as agitation and psychosis. None of these drugs for the behavioral aspects of Alzheimer's disease are currently approved. There are no approved drugs in that space, but there's a lot of work to develop drugs for that. So on the left, you see phase 2 for cognitive enhancers and neuropsychiatric agents. You see again, there's a predominance of NIH funding for the symptomatic drugs, with somewhat less funding from the other types of sponsors. If we look at phase 3 cognitive enhancers, you see that there are again equal number of pharma and NIH sponsors. And if we look at phase 3 neuropsychiatric symptoms, there's a predominance of pharma, but there are still a substantial number of NIH-sponsored trials. So that's phase 3, so that you can see that it is possible for an NIH-sponsored compound to get to phase 3, but if it's likely to become a part of the public regimen for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, it's likely going to be a symptomatic agent and not a disease-modifying agent. Next slide. Finally, I want to show you the action with regard to repurposed agents. There's a lot of interest in repurposing because, as you see in the top box on the left, they're faster to advance. The non-clinical and the phase 1 studies are already done for repurposed agents. These are agents that are approved for some other condition. We worked with one, for example, that was approved for Parkinson's disease, and then we were repurposing it for Alzheimer's disease. In these drugs, the toxicity is known. We have a lot of insight into the dosing, and the manufacturing and supply issues are already resolved. So there are many reasons to think about the benefits of repurposing agents. If you look at the graph there, the blue bars show NIH and academic medical center funding. You see that NIH sponsors many, in fact, most, the vast majority of repurposed agents. Pharmaceutical companies do very little with repurposed agents, mainly because many of them are generic, and therefore the intellectual property issues are very complex to develop for a new indication. So industry and public-private partnerships do very little in the repurposed space, and there are no agents that have progressed, repurposed agents that have progressed to phase 3 at any point in the past 5 years. Next slide. So pharma sponsors most Alzheimer trials, but there's really been a growth in the NIH funding. There's no increase in the pharma funding trials, but there is an increase in private-public partnerships, and pharma is critical in that. The disease-modifying agents in phase 3 are sponsored only by pharmaceutical companies, either as sole sponsors or as members of public-private partnerships. The NIH sponsors most trials of repurposed agents, and funding innovation is needed. You see that there's an imbalance in the way these numbers are playing out. Next slide. So let's talk about drug development and the innovation cycle. Next slide. So I want to start with the cholinesterase inhibitors and show you what I mean by an innovation cycle. So the innovator compound, Tacrin, the first drug ever approved for Alzheimer's disease, was approved in 1993. It was a very difficult agent. It had to be given 4 times a day. It produced hepatotoxicity in about 40% of patients. It had common GI side effects. But look how fast the follow-on compounds came after that pathway was shown to be open. By 1996, donepezil was present, just 3 years later. 2000 was rivastigmine, and 2001 galantamine. These went generic very quickly as well, so that you can see, for example, for rivastigmine, it was approved in 2000 and it was generic by 2007. Galantamine 2001 and generic by 2011. But what else happened during this period? Well, a new indication was developed. So cholinesterase inhibitors were shown to work in Parkinson's disease dementia. That is still the only indication outside of Alzheimer's disease for any approved drug for any dementia. New doses were explored. So high doses were developed for donepezil and rivastigmine, and both of these increased efficacy. New formulations were developed. So the rivastigmine patch and the donepezil orally disintegrating tablet were developed. And there were extended indications. They were approved, for example, for mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, and additional trials extended that to moderate and severe Alzheimer's disease. So when I talk about innovation and that approvals and development of new drugs lead to innovation, this is an example. Next slide. Next slide, please. I think I've made these points. Next slide. Go back one. So another example that I think is worth calling attention to is the approval of beta interferon for multiple sclerosis. Could you go to the beta interferon slide? Go ahead, one slide. Thank you. So this is very interesting because it very much parallels aducanumab. It was approved with an accelerated approval based on an based in part on MRI findings, when the relationship of MRI correlation to disease progression was not completely worked out, as we see in aducanumab, where we're not completely have the complete data set we would like on the relationship between amyloid lowering and clinical benefit. Now, did the approval, accelerated approval of beta interferon, reduce innovation in drug development? And the answer is absolutely not. There have been 22 disease-modifying therapies approved for MS since the approval of beta interferon. This catalyzed the development of new drugs for multiple sclerosis. It did not make it impossible to continue disease-modifying therapies. It did not make it impossible to develop better drugs. It did not over-focus the field on one mechanism. All misgivings that we have heard expressed in the past 2 weeks. Next slide. So the point here is that patients and society pay higher prices for new drugs. The patients and society then benefit from the innovation stimulated by the successful drug. There are decreased disease burden, new populations are treated, new levels of severity are included. New drugs become generic. They lessen the financial burden, and patients and society continue to benefit from the innovations that was stimulated by the approved drugs. We expect similar innovations with newly emerging disease-modifying therapies. Next slide. So I want to end by talking about innovative funding considerations. Next slide. Here's a list of things that I've been following that I find very interesting. First of all, there are dementia-specific investor funds that provide venture capital specifically for dementia. Two of those are the Dementia Discovery Fund in the UK and the LSP Dementia Fund in Europe. There's philanthropy, of course, and venture philanthropy being where a gift is made, but money comes back if the gift leads to a successful business. An example of venture philanthropy is the Alzheimer's Disease Drug Discovery Foundation, and an example of philanthropy is Cure AD. Advocacy groups are very important. For example, the Alzheimer's Association Part to Cloud initiative has funded important trials in Alzheimer's disease. Very interesting, very recently we've seen these long-term opportunity for advancing new studies, that is loans bio bans sponsored by Bob Rush, a Democrat from Illinois, and Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania. This is now before Congress, where there are collateralized loans specifically for research and drug development. These are sold to investors and they're repaid at a low rate of return. Another example of innovative funding is the Mega Fund for Parallel Discovery. This is Andrew Lowe's work. Very interesting to show that if you fund many types of drugs, one will succeed and it will pay for the other drugs that are being explored. And I've mentioned the importance of public-private partnerships and also pre-competitive collaborations where pharmaceutical companies work together, for example, in the Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging initiative, to develop new biomarkers, which can then be used in any company's drug development program. Next slide. So it's important to think about funding in terms of the ecosystem. And there are many parts of the ecosystem for drug development. And we need to fund all of them, or else there will be bottlenecks that prevent drug development for going forward. So it's very important that we think about the entire ecosystem and making sure that we're supporting that ecosystem. It's not just about one company, it's about an ecosystem that brings forward new drugs for any diseases, including Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. Now, we're all concerned about equity, and I just wanted to use an example of COVID here and the difficulties that we face with equity. So here I'm looking at the vaccination rates by continent. You see that in North America, 65% of people are vaccinated. South America, 32%. In Africa, 2.9%. And this is for an urgent drug where we have the vaccine readily available. You can imagine the difficulty of getting an infusible compound like the new monoclonal antibodies across the world in something that we would consider equity. Next slide. So if I could summarize the things that I'd like you to take away from this, it's that Alzheimer's disease drug development is long and costly, and the failure rate is high. That new therapies lead to innovations that generate value for patients and for society. That the approval of aducanumab is expected to catalyze Alzheimer's disease drug development, and we're already seeing that happen. Therapeutic advances lead to implementation, cost, reimbursement, and equity challenges. Isn't it great that our successes have led us to have to consider these challenges? Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to Dwayne's presentation, and I will take questions afterwards.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Cummings. And next we have Dwayne's presentation.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much, Dr. Cummings. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm a health economist. I'm not a practitioner. I crunch the numbers and say things to people sometimes that they don't like to hear, and I'm sure I'm going to do some of that today, unfortunately. But what I'm mostly going to talk about in the context of the presentation is some of the legislative proposals that have emanating from the U.S. Congress, and what their potential impact will be given what Dr. Cummings has laid out extremely well are the challenges of financing and the costs of the clinical research around Alzheimer's disease. So this is a deck from April 1st. I'm going to jump ahead of stuff that sort of duplicates what Dr. Cummings has said. There's no reason to beat a dead horse here. We're kind of running parallel here, and a lot of things we agree, but I will point out in certain areas where we don't necessarily agree. And I think one of the key points we'd like to make, since the release of this deck on April 1st, yes, aducanumab was successfully approved, at least under a conditional approval by the FDA. And obviously this decision has been met with a high amount of controversy. There's been over 300 clinical trials since the last approval that occurred over 14 years. And those were all chasing the beta amyloid thesis, where you reduce the beta amyloid plaque in MRI scans. You could measure this and see this and then track it with cognitive improvement. Now, the difficulty with a lot of these clinical trials is now we're actually getting drugs that effectively reduce the plaque, but the statistical relationship with the cognitive improvement is where there's a bit of a gray area. And actually, Adalimumab failed the phase 3, showing cognitive improvement in the high dose, high plaque removal arm of the trial. And so essentially what you have is more plaque removed, not necessarily the result you were expecting. And that's sort of the second bullet here from the appendix of the FDA review. It's a 300+ page review. It's quite complex. It's hard to go through. But if you do weed through that for about a week, which we've done at the firm, again, what it boils down to is you're not getting that statistical relationship. So again, what you're seeing then is they moved into the conditional approval, which has a lower bar. Essentially, the data standard for accelerated approval is available when it's reasonably likely. So again, we're not talking statistical certainty at this point, we're talking reasonable likelihood. This was first presented and quite controversial regarding a Duchenne muscular dystrophy drug 2 years ago. This had similar pathway analysis where they failed the clinical phase 3 and then they moved it into conditional approval. Again, our assessments around amyloid beta, we are skeptical of the amyloid beta thesis overall as a firm. And we do think there will be other mechanisms that potentially will show greater effectiveness for improving cognitive disorders, improving cognitive ability. But what we're certain now is going to happen, and I think Dr. Cummings and I completely agree on this, is you're going to see a lot more work in amyloid beta because the floodgates are going to open, because now people see a pathway to get approval. And we've already seen 2 breakthrough designations, one with Lilly and another with Biogen in the last 10 days. So there's going to be more work in this space. So moving forward, again, we've gone over this. We're going to see 13.8 million people by 2050. The costs, and one point I'd like to make, the costs are roughly $305 billion to society. And again, one thing that is included in those costs that I think was not touched on earlier, which we need to point out, is generally when you get to advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease, one of the key drivers of cost is that someone needs to stay home as a caregiver, and that's often a family member. So your costs are also lost income. So there's a huge deadweight cost to the economy for Alzheimer's disease. It's very, very expensive in productivity. And it's a really debilitating disease from the standpoint that it doesn't hurt one person, it generally hurts 2 or 3 because the family has to often be the caregiver. And this is really problematic. So anything we can do to try and improve this going forward will be helpful, but that's one of the key drivers of the costs. So what's going on? This bill, HR 3, that's in the US Congress, how do we feel this is going to impact clinical research? Well, what is HR 3 does is it says the US is no longer going to price drug discovery and drug pricing based on the current negotiating process that occurs in Medicare and Medicaid and with the private insurers. It's going to be based on a basket of countries internationally. So the UK, France, Australia, Canada, Japan, the average of those prices is going to be the negotiating position of the drugs. There's some complexity in there. You could put 20% more, but generally it's going to be this basket average that's going to be the negotiating position, and that's your maximum. And then the Health and Human Services will negotiate down from there. Now, what this is essentially is a price ceiling. And what price ceilings do is it means you don't meet demand. And there's a history of price ceilings. I don't want to beat a dead horse here for this, but essentially, if we look at bread lines, food lines in the old Soviet Union and what's been happening in Venezuela, that is because they're putting a price ceiling for food that does not meet demand. 1973, the oil embargo, the OPEC oil embargo, Richard Nixon set a maximum price for a gallon of gasoline. This led to supply shortages, huge lines across the United States to get gasoline. And there's been several articles since that say, hey, look, price controls don't work. And what that does is it restricts supply. If you look at how Europe has managed the numbers, and I'm guessing that Dr. Cummings' numbers puts it a little over 50 per 100 population. That also includes the UK, and the UK has done extremely well. If you remove the UK from the data and actually look at the European Union as a whole, what the European Union did was set a maximum price per dose of the vaccines of $12. And what this meant was they had to restrict supply. And I would highly recommend this Political article. It's a 15,000 word really great deconstruction of how this all played out and went down from January 21st. Highly recommend this article, sort of showing how Europe went for price controls over access and what this has meant. And then the data from March, and this is a percentage per 100 people. If you look at the amount per day, Israel's was doing 1.1% per day. The United Kingdom and the United States were doing about 0.5% per day. I live in Belgium. I'm actually broadcasting from my office here in Brussels right now. Belgium has been down to 0.1% per day. It's going to take over 800 days to vaccinate the entire population at current rates in Belgium. This is what happens when you put in price controls. If you look for price and you don't actually maximize the opportunity to have access, this is what will happen. You will have to restrict supply. Right now, today, not just Alzheimer's drugs, but oncology products, cancer drugs, it's taking over 540 days for an average approval post the European Medicines Agency to get access in France. For example, Germany is about 300. Germany is immediate, but then they have a renewal period at 6 months. Spain is about 300 days. So again, we're talking 2-year delays where they're trying to stretch out this cost curve and restrict access to try and get the pricing better from the standpoint of the cost of the public purse. Now, we don't do that in the US. We stress access. And so by importing these economics into the United States, this is going to have a radical impact on our healthcare system. How radical? Well, here are all the companies that are going to be impacted by HR3 if we include 125 drugs under Medicare Part D and B. In fact, they can go up to 250 drugs. We only modeled 175 because after 175, the marginal impact was so huge. What you find is that if you look at the neurology products, this is Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, all the neurological products, you're looking at close to a 60% loss of revenue in this basket price. And this is the best option. This is the best price you're going to get. So we're looking at a 60% reduction in those classes. You're looking at a 40% overall reduction in the sector for 125 drugs. There's also a budget line in the bill that you're going to include insulin. This gives a $150 billion revenue loss per year. Now, again, the EBIT for all the earnings of the companies involved, if we look at all the 142 companies, or excuse me, the 42 companies that were involved with these 125 drugs, we're looking at a little over 200 billion in earnings. So we're really talking, a 70-75% reduction of net revenue. This is going to have devastating impacts, particularly in Alzheimer's. What does 70% do? Well, again, you've seen the cost right now. You've seen that it's 5 billion, 6 billion. Now, obviously, we've had an approval. That'll impact the cost curve. But what we know from previous research we've done, and I'm going to stress this here, we can estimate with high accuracy with a nonlinear regression statistically, and you can find all the data in this link here, that you can actually look at early stage investments by venture capitalists and investors, and you can actually predict peak sales to an R-square of 77%. So this means we're answering 77% of the regression model. Where here you can see that 0.773%. So we're actually answering most of the variability. In other words, you can actually, with high predictive analysis, guess and figure out what an investor is going to do if you reduce revenues or if the asset's going to make revenues. And these revenues are often made 10 years after the investment. Investors are very good and they're very sensitive to revenue. So if we can predict with revenue, we can reduce revenue and guess what's going to happen quite accurately, we feel. Again, Dr. Cummings was very good at mentioning how there'd been a slow movement away particularly from the industry side, and the slack's being picked up by the NIH. Unfortunately, if you look at NIH funding where the private sector is not there, there's a very low statistical probability, slightly better than zero. Without private funding, without industry funding, there's virtually a 0% probability of market access, looking at 25,000 NIH grants, which we've done. The private sector needs to be there and needs to be there for size with over 90% of the funding mix. And if they're not there, you're not going to have market access. And what you see here, because of the high risk of failure, because of the challenges of Alzheimer's, we've gone from 267 industry-sponsored trials in 2009 to 2014 from this study to 129 trials, so more, almost half. A huge reduction in the amount of research that's been done by the industry just because of the risk profile, and this is before we're talking 70% reductions of revenue in neurological disorders. The current drugs, as Dr. Cummings mentioned, only treat cognitive symptoms and amyloid beta, the plaque. Yeah, this is still an unproven thesis statistically, even in the current crop. There's a lot of questions in the current data. So what's going to happen if we look at the overwhelming majority of trials that are going on internationally? They're mostly in the United States. Again, there's 151 trials over currently that are active in the United States of the 276 globally. And you can see New York, Massachusetts, Indiana, obviously, these are going to follow where the companies are based. Indiana's obviously where Lilly is. They've just had a breakthrough approval. California, obviously Biogen in New Jersey and California as well. So the real centers here where these things are taking place. Now, statistically, if we look at what has happened on the approvals, again, you have a 98.5% chance of failure. We have 2 approved drugs that treat 4 assets, not including Adalimumab. And we look at what's happened before then. So we have 2 assets out of 276 that treat 4 indications. That's roughly a 98.5% failure rate if you do the math on the 276 products. Now, if you adjust that failure rate of 98.3% based on the statistical probability of market entry when you reduce the revenues by 70%, essentially now you're at an adjusted failure rate of 99.7%. That's the risk profile that these drugs will have. In other words, you're going to radically impact the ability and the appetite of investors to go into a sector with high failure rates, or at least if they're not making revenue. Now, again, we had approval with Adalimumab. It'll be interesting to see what happens and if revenue is there. It's also going to be interesting to see if insurance companies are willing to make a bet on this drug, given the nature of the statistics of the clinical trial and the questions around it. But again, assuming that the current failure rates around the beta amyloid thesis hold, and there is not a radical improvement, we've had 301 failures with the exception of the one that just came out, 99.7% is your adjusted failure rate. That would probably indicate that there would be, if HR3 is passed, an exodus completely from this sector. Final conclusions: Alzheimer's disease is one of the key areas of unmet medical need. Large pharmaceutical companies have downsized their risk portfolio even before clinical trial failure rates are in excess of 98% today. Dr. Cummings and I fully agree on that. And then the question is, what's going to happen when you radically reduce the revenue potential? It's going to throw this into an area where the risk-reward profile is completely out the window. And again, the reduction of probability to discover drugs by 80% overall in the entire cohort will happen with the current failure rates. We're going to see Alzheimer's essentially get zeroed out. So HR3 is going to be radically debilitating, and we would really suggest everything possible not to pass that legislation in its current form. And I'm happy to discuss options as we go through the Q&A. I'll buzz through that in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, Ashley. Can you move forward? One more slide. Great. Thank you. Yep. And so now we enter the question and answer portion of today's webinar. So if you have a question you would like to ask Mr. Scholtes or Dr. Cummings, please submit it in the chat box below. So it looks like we have a couple questions. So this one is directed to Dr. Cummings. Dr. Cummings, can you speak to the importance of Alzheimer's disease clinical trial participation? Currently, less than 1% of those living with Alzheimer's disease participate in trials.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Jim, for watching and for being part of the audience. Great to have you here. Yes, clinical trial participation is one of the great drivers of cost for Alzheimer's disease. Right now, if you look at the length that someone gets treated in a trial, let's say it's 12 months, see if the drug works, it takes longer than 12 months just to recruit enough patients to test the drug, which means that a drug where the treatment period is 12 months will be more than 2 years from beginning to end. That's a tremendous slowing of drug development and greatly drives the expense of drug development. So yes, 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 we need active clinical trial participation. Thank you.
Great. We have another. Wouldn't aducanumab's one successful trial be a more important indicator of effectiveness than the failed one? My understanding is that amyloid is an early stage catalyst, but an indeterminate point, the disorder progresses and removal of amyloid becomes no longer effective. And this is why every previous amyloid targeting drug fails in phase 3.
Do you want me to take that on?
Yeah, Dwayne, why don't you start? And I'll also add to it. I think you're a little bit more skeptical of this than I am. So let's get both points of view out here.
Sure. The trial was structured around 3 different dosage levels with a cognitive test for statistical correlation and probability. Well, the problem with the current test is it failed in phase 3 due to a lack of evidentiary basis. And the problem is that the test that showed statistical significance was sort of the midpoint test, the midpoint clearing. The high dose test that cleared more amyloid beta did not show statistical significance. So again, it's possible. It's possible that this may show cognitive improvement. Biogen has 9 years to show, so we'll see what happens. It obviously the time, as Dr. Cummings has mentioned, the time horizon with these clinical trials with Alzheimer's is part of the challenge. I mean, the reason why they have the conditional approval is for 9 years to deliver the data is it will take that long to collate the data. And this has been a very long clinical trial already. So essentially you do have the 3 scenarios built into the 3 arms of the trial that would have theoretically tested the 3 points for cognitive approved ability. And you should have seen if the theory is more plaque removal, better cognitive performance, that was not shown statistically in the testing. So time will tell, time will out. And I'm sure Dr. Cumming and I will disagree on this, but that's fine.
Well, I would just say that the exact relationship between the plaque lowering and the cognitive outcome really is still being explored.
Sure.
So it does look like when you see plaque lowering that there is some associated slowing. That's what I see in the data, and that's looking at donanemab, lecanemab, and aducanumab. So if you look across those trials, it looks like there's some consistency in terms of amyloid lowering and a cognitive slowing. But we're not sure that removing the plaque is the only thing that is going on with these drugs. They also might be removing other types of amyloid, which have toxicity as well, although that seems less likely with donanemab. So these are still questions that are being answered. Overall, I see this as a very favorable direction with lots of questions and lots of learnings to come.
Great. Something I'm interested in. How do you see the potential creation of ARPAH? So this is the proposed $6.5 billion new research center modeled after DARPA, but for biomedical research. How do you see that impacting private funding for Alzheimer's disease research and other forms of dementia? Do you think that it will attract private research, or?
I'll happily take that on. Right now, we don't know what's in the bill. It's unknown if it's going to be in NIH or outside of NIH as a separate DARPA organization. We recently did a podcast with Jack Scannell, arguably one of the best analysts and clinical development researchers on the planet. His opinion is where we have problems, and obviously the discussion we're having now about the current conditional approval, is the modeling for effectiveness. What we have now is where we have good effectiveness models, good mouse models that are highly predictive of human impact of drugs. We have very good drugs where we have great models for monoclonal cancers. We have wonderful monoclonal antibodies that are highly, highly effective for, say, leukemias. Rituximab is a fabulous example of a drug that's extremely effective, where we have an extremely good model and it's very predictive of how it's going to work. Alzheimer's has been really brutal in areas where prediction, and anywhere where we're finding hard, neurological disorders in particular have been very, very tough. So I think what there's a general feeling is, rather than do drug development and compete or substitute for the industry, which is very effective as we've seen in the data, what would be interesting would be to have ARPAH move further up the value chain and start helping with develop these complex models, predictive analytics that could actually give us better models to target because where we have those, that's where we get very effective therapeutics. Right now, there's a big gap there, a huge gap, because in many ways, the low-hanging fruit is already picked.
And I would just say that, as Dwayne said, we really don't know what's in this DARPA Med plan at this point. So it's hard to predict its impact. In a general way, more discoveries attract more capital. So I would be optimistic about it, but I have no idea how much might be coming into Alzheimer's disease or where that money is going.
We have another question. Dr. Cummings, can you speak to a future cocktail? We have exciting amyloid drugs in the pipeline. Alzheimer, I apologize for mispronouncing that, may reduce inflammation. What about tau drugs? Are there any exciting breakthroughs you're looking forward to in the making?
Yes, thanks again, Jim. Really great question. I'd make the point in this way, that if you take the very most optimistic view of the amyloid lowering drugs, and I would say it is the finding on the ADAS-Cog in the lecanemab trial, where it's slowed by 47% compared to the placebo decline. That means that we're only accounting at the very best for half of the decline with amyloid lowering. And that just cries out for combination therapy if we're going to try to preserve cognition at a higher level. And the two targets you mentioned are very much in the forefront of people's minds. There's more anti-inflammatory drugs in the pipeline right now than any other class of drugs. So there's a lot of exploration in those drugs. There's a lot of interest in tau. Tau is a little bit more difficult target right now, probably because we don't understand it as well. But yes, absolutely, we're thinking about combination treatments. It's hard to develop combination treatments, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying.
I think we have time remaining for one final question. So policymakers like to point to NIH NIH research investment as an argument for why drug companies should reduce their prices. Policymakers have suggested that the government should be paid back through IP waivers and other tactics. Should NIH or the broader federal government benefit more from industry clinical development or not? Why or why not?
If we look, we just published a study where we looked at 24,000 NIH grants from the year 2000, and then we looked at buy-dole patents that were created from those 24,000 grants. There were roughly 8,000 buy-dole patents that were created from the year 2000. You can then trace those patents. You find that they link to 41 assets that entered clinical research, and from those 41 assets, 18 drugs came to market. The total contribution for the 18 drugs that came to market from the NIH was roughly 600 million, where the industrial contribution was 44.2 billion for those 18 drugs. Now, that aside, one could make the argument it doesn't matter the total amount because the NIH money is earlier, it's higher risk, it has a more statistical impact on results. In fact, when you lay out the logistic regression on the percentages of funding, first off, when you isolate them when you isolate the contributions from NIH and the private sector does correlate statistically with a very low p-value, p0.00001, that yes, it does correlate with success, whereas in fact, what you find is as the NIH contribution gets larger, the failure rates get higher. Now, it's not statistically significant, but it is predictive, and there's a tendency there. When you actually compare the two in collective, when you look at the percentage of funding as a, say, what percentage of funding is the private sector? So if you have 100% NIH funding, which is our baseline, and then you add in private sector funding, when you see zero private sector funding, you see zero probability of market entry across the 41 assets. Where you see the private sector be 90 to 95% private funding, the mix, the percentage, you get roughly 50% probability of market entry. And when you get over 98%, you have a 60% probability of market entry. It's not axiomatic. The fact is the private sector is vital in this relationship of taking an NIH buy-dole asset and then moving it to market. And it takes about 25 years from the first NIH grant on our data set to actually get marketing approval. So we can say that the NIH will be the vital link in the cog, and it's certainly a key part to developing the asset. But just because you have a good idea does not mean you have a product. It's overwhelmingly the private sector statistically that drives that market entry.
And I would just add briefly to that, Ryan, that NIH does concentrate on target development, so it's very early, and their contributions are important at that foundational level. But that's why we need to think about the ecosystem. It's not the NIH and private industry. It's a whole ecosystem of which the NIA is a part, and as Dwayne makes a point, relatively small part, particularly as assets get moved further along the pipeline.
Great. I think that's a perfect way to end this webinar today. So Ashley, can you move on to the final slide in the deck? Great. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar, and also a big thank you to Dr. Cummings and Dwayne for joining us today. We appreciate you being so generous with your time and sharing your expertise with us. A recording of today's presentation will be posted on the Activity website in the next couple of weeks. And also, if you have any questions for me, my email address is posted below. We look forward to hearing from you if you want to learn more about the coalition or have ideas for future programming. But once again, thank you, both Dr. Cummings and Dwayne, for joining us today, and everyone who attended today's presentation. So thank you.